Well, you've got to be interesting on stage to look at. You can't be standing there looking at your shoes, like all these musicians do. And you've got to be an actor, really. And you've got to be good and loud, too, And you've got to know what the fuck you're doing on your instrument, too, because if you can't fake it.
He played his final show on a Friday night in Berlin. Just 15 days later, he was gone. The doctor who finally discovered what was wrong only caught it by chance. His speech had started to sound slurred, and someone pushed for a brain scan. But here's the part that almost never gets talked about. The man the world had reduced to a wild image of cigarettes, whiskey, and non-stop chaos, the loud, rough face of rock and roll, was also one of the most disciplined, well-read, and principled people the music industry had ever seen. The bullet belt was real. The warts were real. The stories about countless relationships and finishing a bottle every day were real. But so was the man who couldn't fall asleep without reading a book. So was the person who strongly opposed Nazi ideology so much that even after his death, his bandmates still found themselves explaining his views.
And I don't give a fuck who you are. You ain't going to do that on adrenaline and being high on life. I don't care, Not when you're 33 years old, you're going to need a little help there, But it's also purely recreational as well, Who cares, what the fuck, People invented it, should be able to do it,
And so was the polite, respectful, almost old-school gentleman who, only a couple of hours before the end, sincerely thanked a friend for bringing him antique military history books. This is the story of Ian Fraser Kilmister, the English kid who grew up in a small Welsh village, a boy whose father left before he was even old enough to remember him. A musician who got fired from one famous band, named the next one after a slang term for a drug, and turned rejection into a career that lasted more than 40 years. He created one of the loudest bands the world has ever heard, then watched every classic member pass away within just a few years of his own death. And his incredible journey came to an unexpected end only 2 days after receiving a diagnosis that almost nobody saw coming. Stick with me, because by the end of this video you'll understand why the people who actually knew Lemmy say the public misunderstood him for years. Number 12. The English Boy in a Welsh World. Long before he became the bullet-belted icon of pure volume, Lemmy was just a lonely kid who never really felt like he belonged. He was born on Christmas Eve in 1945 in Stoke-on-Trent, an industrial city in England's Midlands.
Oh, it's old slang for speed freak. If you look at the Mothers of Invention albums way back, you'll find James Motorhead Sherwood. It means motor mouth as well, somebody who won't stop talking, which is also true of us,
His father had served as a Royal Air Force chaplain and was also a talented concert pianist, but he left when Ian was only 3 months old. That one event shaped much of his life. It helped build a lasting distrust of organized religion, a deep dislike of authority, and a determination to live life on his own terms no matter what anyone thought. After his mother remarried, the family eventually moved to a farm in Benlec, on the Isle of Anglesey in North Wales. There, young Ian Kilmister found himself growing up in a place that would quickly teach him how to become tough and independent. He was the only English kid in a school filled with around 700 Welsh-speaking students. It wasn't an easy place to fit in. Years later, using the dry sense of humor that caught so many people off guard, he described those years by saying, "Not the happiest time, but interesting from an anthropological point of view." That one line says a lot about Lemmy. He faced hard times without feeling sorry for himself, stored the memories away, and later turned them into jokes that only he could tell. Then, at just 16 years old, one night in Liverpool changed the direction of his life forever. Number 11. The night he saw the Beatles. At 16, Ian Kilmister walked into Liverpool's famous Cavern Club and watched the Beatles perform before they became worldwide superstars. The experience completely changed his outlook. He went home, got their first album, and taught himself every guitar part note by note. But the biggest impact wasn't what most people think. It wasn't the harmonies or the famous hairstyles that pulled him in. It was the attitude. He admired John Lennon's sharp personality, his quick wit, his refusal to play it safe, and the way he could be both smart and fearless at the same time. That mix of intelligence and edge became the foundation for the image Lemmy would later build for himself. He spent the next few years playing in local Midlands bands that history has mostly forgotten, groups like the Rainmakers and the Motown Sect.
Rock and roll should be rebellion for its own sake, with no clear goal in mind, fueled by all kinds of fun, and like with naked women all over the place backstage. I don't care what your prejudices are. I don't have them. You know, I love women. I think they should be naked backstage all the time. I love looking at them. It's great. I'm not sorry for one moment of it. I always treat them like they should be treated. I'm a gentleman, you know.
He played guitar in pubs, worked in a factory making household appliances, and even spent time working at a horse riding school. There wasn't some master plan waiting for him. There was no financial safety net and no family fortune to fall back on. What he did have was a stubborn belief that the ordinary life people expected him to live simply wasn't meant for him. So, like many young people chasing music during the late 1960s, he headed to London looking for a chance. What he found was an opportunity that many musicians could only dream about. Before long, he was helping carry equipment for one of the most influential guitar players in rock history. Number 10. Hauling gear for Jimi Hendrix. In 1967, Lemmy ended up sharing a flat in London with Noel Redding, the bass player for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. That connection helped him land work as a roadie, carrying guitars, amplifiers, and other equipment for Hendrix, sometimes working 2 shows in the same day. Lemmy always laughed about how he got the job. According to him, it wasn't because of special talent, it was simply because he happened to be in the right place at the right time. Even so, it gave him a front-row view of one of music's greatest performers. He often described Hendrix as a prince, saying that away from the stage, he had old-fashioned manners and treated people with real kindness. It surprised many people because it didn't match Hendrix's public image at all.
We got people who have every visible surface of their body tattooed with the Motörhead logo, you know, and like all the album sleeves. One guy in Jimi, he's got 3 faces on his calves of his legs, man. He's got, you know, I mean, I don't know if I'd do it, you know what I mean? I admire his pain threshold, you know. Because that shit hurts, you know. I mean, I've only got 3 little ones, you know, and they hurt like hell, I don't know.
If that sounds familiar, remember it, because Lemmy would later develop a very similar reputation himself, the fierce rock star on stage, but a polite and respectful gentleman away from the spotlight. He also shared colorful stories from those years, including claims about Hendrix returning from America with large amounts of LSD and passing it around to friends and crew. As with many of Lemmy's stories, it's worth remembering that he loved telling a great tale, so some details are difficult to verify. But one lesson stayed with him for life. He had seen one of the loudest performers in music turn out to be one of the most polite people behind the scenes. Before long, Lemmy would get his own chance to stand in the spotlight, but that chapter would end with him being thrown out of his band after an arrest at an international border. Number 9. Silver Machine and the Border Arrest. By August 1971, Lemmy had talked his way into the space rock band Hawkwind, even though he had barely played bass before joining. Instead of letting that hold him back, he learned as he went, performing live while developing a style that was completely his own. Rather than playing like a traditional bassist, he attacked the instrument almost like a rhythm guitarist, creating a thick, distorted wall of sound that quickly became his signature. Then came the moment that looked like it would change everything. Lemmy sang lead vocals on Hawkwind's hit single Silver Machine, and in 1972 the song climbed all the way to number 3 on the UK charts. At last, he had a major hit and seemed ready for even bigger things. But in May 1975, during a North American tour, everything suddenly changed. While crossing into Canada near Windsor, Ontario, Lemmy was arrested on a drug possession charge. Then came an unexpected twist. Authorities initially accused him of possessing cocaine, but according to later accounts, the substance involved was actually amphetamine. The stimulant he openly admitted was his drug of choice at the time. Because of the way the case unfolded, the charge did not ultimately stand, and Lemmy was released. Even so, the fallout hit almost immediately. Hawkwind worried the situation could create problems during future tours, and had also grown frustrated with his lifestyle. After the very next show, the band dismissed him. Lemmy felt deeply betrayed, and that setback lit a fire under him instead of stopping him. Number 8. The band named after a drug. His first choice for a new band's name was Bastard. His manager quickly told him that a group with that name would struggle to get mainstream exposure, so Lemmy started looking for another idea.
So-called heavy metal, whatever you want to call it, I call it rock and roll, and it is the logical successor to original rock and roll. All right, if Eddie Cochran was like 18 now, he'd be in a garage with a band, playing the Les Paul copy from Japan. That's what he'd be doing, because it's the same urge to make a loud noise to piss your parents off and to get laid. Basically, is what we're talking about. So this is the scabby bastard child of rock and roll, right? So that's why I like it. That's why it'll always come back. They'll never get rid of it. They try every 3 years or so, they try and stamp it out. They have demetalizing classes, in Wisconsin.
He settled on the title of the last song he had written for Hawkwind, Motorhead. In British slang, the word referred to someone heavily associated with amphetamines. The name fit the fast, aggressive image he wanted. He even placed an umlaut over the O simply because he thought it looked tougher. Years later, he joked that he borrowed the idea from Blue Oyster Cult, only for Mötley Crüe to later use the same styling themselves. The umlaut didn't change how the word was pronounced. It wasn't about language at all, it was all about attitude. Lemmy then brought in guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke and drummer Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor. Together, the three created the classic Motorhead lineup that many fans still consider the band's greatest era. Their mission couldn't have been simpler: make everything louder than everyone else. Before long, Motorhead had built a reputation as one of the loudest live bands anywhere. Stories spread about concerts so powerful that people claimed bits of plaster shook loose from the ceilings. Whether every story was completely accurate almost didn't matter. Those legends became part of the band's identity. And even with all that growing attention, the song that would define Lemmy's legacy for decades was still waiting to arrive, and he never even believed it was the band's best work. Number 7. Ace of Spades. In 1980, Motorhead released Ace of Spades, and everything changed. The album shot to number 4 on the UK charts, while the title track became the song that would define Lemmy for the rest of his life. With its pounding bass line, gritty vocals, and lyrics about gambling and living without fear, it became an anthem that fans still celebrate today. Born to lose, live to win. Those words became closely linked with his image and attitude. The song captured everything people thought Motorhead stood for. Then, just a year later, the band released the live album No Sleep Till Hammersmith, and it pulled off something none of their studio albums had managed before. It went straight to number 1 on the UK album chart. Suddenly, the loudest, roughest, least fashionable rock band in Britain was sitting at the very top. But there's an interesting twist. Lemmy himself never treated Ace of Spades like it was the greatest thing he had ever written. In fact, he sometimes grew frustrated that many people acted as if it were the only song he had ever made, even though he had written hundreds during his career. There was another point he defended again and again. He never believed Motorhead should be called a heavy metal band. Instead, he repeatedly said they played rock and roll, the same style of music that had inspired him as a teenager after seeing the Beatles perform in Liverpool. Dave Grohl, who admired Lemmy for years, often recalled how determined he was about that point. "We are Motorhead," he liked to say, "and we play rock and roll." But as time passed, the larger-than-life image began to overshadow the real person. That's where this story takes another surprising turn. Number 6. The reader behind the bullet belt. This is where the public image starts to fall apart. Most people saw the leather, the cigarette, the whiskey, the bass guitar, and the permanent scowl. But the people who spent real time with Lemmy often describe someone completely different. Journalist Bill Dunn, who traveled with him for several days, later said he was shocked by how intelligent Lemmy was.
Well, Sid used to wear a T-shirt with a swastika on it, people think I look like a fucking Nazi, and they always do, Then they're in a lot of trouble, in their head, because anything less like a Nazi you could not find. I've had 4 living girlfriends, and they've all been black. I couldn't really introduce them to Der Fuhrer at the Nuremberg rally, could I? "This is my wife, Mein Fuhrer." "Oh, yeah?" Yeah.
Describing him as about 20 IQ points too intelligent for the character many people assumed he was playing. Lemmy explained it himself. "My mind has to be occupied all the time. Without a book, I'd go nuts." While others on tour often headed out looking for excitement after shows, Lemmy was just as likely to stay backstage or in the dressing room with a book in his hands. Reading wasn't just a hobby, it was part of his daily routine. He developed a deep interest in history, especially military history, and surprised interviewers with thoughtful conversations about politics, historical events, Monty Python, and classic comedy writers. That was one of the biggest secrets behind the Motörhead legend. The man who looked completely out of control on stage was often one of the calmest and most disciplined people once the show was over. Lemmy even explained it in his own words. "It is not two personas," he said. "I'm wild on stage, but you can't do that all the time. You'll wear yourself out." It was a lesson he had first noticed years earlier while watching Jimi Hendrix step off stage, where the larger-than-life performer became a quiet, courteous gentleman once the music stopped. But there was one part of Lemmy's image that sparked arguments for decades, and the debate didn't end after he passed away. Number 5. The collection that followed him to the grave. Lemmy filled his home with military memorabilia, daggers, medals, helmets, uniforms, and other historical items. Many of the pieces were German, and many dated back to the Second World War. To plenty of people, those items looked deeply troubling, and they weren't shy about saying so. It's understandable why the collection raised difficult questions. Even some fellow musicians found the imagery unsettling. But there's another side that often received far less attention. For more than 40 years, Lemmy gave the same explanation, and the people who knew him best consistently stood by it. "I only collect the stuff," he said. "I didn't collect the ideas." Looking at the collection through the eyes of someone fascinated by history, he argued that armies throughout history often created striking uniforms, regardless of the causes they represented. He even joked that if the British Army had designed uniforms more interesting than plain khaki, he would have collected those too. Lemmy repeatedly said he did not have a racist bone in his body, and often pointed out that his friends came from many different backgrounds and beliefs. The people closest to him echoed those views after his death. Guitarist Phil Campbell publicly addressed the rumors, saying he was a historian. He did not have any Nazi tendencies. Drummer Mickey D was just as direct, saying he hated Nazis. He hated stupidity. Two of Lemmy's close friends who came to honor his memory were Jewish musicians. To those who knew him personally, the collection reflected an interest in military history, not support for hateful beliefs. It created one of the biggest contradictions in his public image. He looked like the villain in a movie, dressed in military-style gear and living by his own rules. Yet the people around him described someone who strongly rejected the hateful ideology connected to many of those symbols. But even that controversy wasn't the deepest pain he carried. The hardest chapter of his life was one he rarely talked about. Number 4. The love he lost and the drug he hated. Despite the stories about countless relationships, Lemmy never married. For most of his adult life, he lived largely on his own, and there was a deeply personal reason he kept that part of himself private. As a young man, he fell deeply in love with a woman named Susan Bennett.
Oh, we're not cute enough. That's the problem with that. Yeah. And we don't sing, songs that you can sing along to in bars, or play at your wedding,
He later described her as the greatest love of his life. She died at a young age after struggles involving heroin, and decades later he dedicated his autobiography to her memory. That loss helps explain one of the strongest convictions he held for the rest of his life. Although Lemmy openly talked about using amphetamines during different periods of his career and sometimes joked about them in interviews, he spoke very differently about heroin. The death of Susan left a lasting mark on him, and he never hid his deep hatred of that drug. In his mind, there was a clear line between the substances he had spoken about using and the one he believed had taken away the person he loved most. For Lemmy, that line wasn't just personal, it was shaped by lasting grief that stayed with him for the rest of his life. In 2005, Lemmy even stood before the Welsh Assembly to share his views on drug policy, and during that speech he spoke about Susan. "I lived with a young woman who tried heroin just to see what it was like," he said. "It killed her." Those few words revealed a deeply personal loss that he rarely discussed. Behind the loud voice and fearless image was a quiet pain he carried for nearly half a century. But by the time Lemmy reached his late 60s, the body that had survived decades of non-stop touring and hard living could no longer hide the damage. Number 3. The body starts to break. For years, people joked that Lemmy was impossible to bring down, and that reputation gave birth to one of the biggest legends about him. According to a story Lemmy often repeated, a doctor supposedly told him that his blood had become so full of alcohol and amphetamines that giving him a normal blood transfusion would be dangerous, while his own blood would be harmful to someone else. It's an unforgettable story. However, there is no reliable medical evidence supporting that claim, so it's best understood as part of the larger mythology that grew around Lemmy over the years, rather than as an established medical fact. The real story was dramatic enough on its own. Time eventually caught up with him. He developed diabetes and high blood pressure, and in 2013, doctors implanted a defibrillator after serious heart problems and a difficult medical procedure. From that point on, he began making changes. On medical advice, he swapped his favorite whiskey for vodka, cut back on smoking after years of going through around 2 packs a day, and tried to slow down where he could. Even with those changes, performing became more difficult. Then came the night that shocked everyone. During a show in Austin, Texas, in September 2015, he managed only 3 songs before walking to the microphone and saying the words no Motorhead fan expected to hear: "I can't do it." Then he left the stage. The man who had built his reputation on pushing through every obstacle had finally been stopped by his own body. He had only a little more than 3 months left to live. But before the final chapter closed, another heartbreaking sequence had already begun. The legendary Motorhead lineup started disappearing one member at a time. Number 2. The band that died together. There is something deeply emotional about the way the classic Motorhead lineup left the world.
Commercial is a funny word to use as an insult, because being commercial just means that more people bought your music, which is what you're trying to do when you set out to make most people as possible hear your music. That's why you do it, you know. And anybody who says, I don't want fame and fortune, is full of shit, man. I don't give a fuck who they are. You know, that's rubbish. If you want nobody to hear your music, stay in the living room. Nobody will. No problem, you know. But don't be out on stage showing off and tell me you don't want nobody to hear it.
In November 2015, drummer Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, whose playing helped shape classics like Ace of Spades, passed away at the age of 61. Lemmy was heartbroken, and only about 7 weeks later, he too was gone. The final surviving member of that iconic trio, guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke, lived until January 2018 before he also passed away. By then, every member of Motorhead's most celebrated lineup had been lost. Former guitarist Vurcell had already died several years earlier. In only a short span of time, the band that had spent its career promising to make everything louder than everyone else had fallen completely silent. When it was all over, drummer Mickey D summed it up with a few unforgettable words: "Motorhead is over, of course." Lemmy was Motorhead. There was never any real question about continuing without him, but the final chapter of Lemmy's life unfolded with shocking speed, and almost nobody saw it coming. Number 1. 15 days. On the 11th of December 2015, Motorhead played a concert in Berlin. Lemmy walked off that stage the same way he had walked off thousands of others during his career. Nobody in the audience knew they had just witnessed his final performance. A few days later, back in Los Angeles, friends gathered to celebrate his 70th birthday at the famous Whiskey A Go Go on the Sunset Strip. It was a fitting place, considering he had spent roughly 25 years living just a couple of blocks away in a modest 2-room apartment. Nearly every day, he could be found at his favorite nearby bar, relaxing and playing the trivia machine that had become part of his daily routine. Not long afterward, something changed. His speech started to become slurred, and someone close to him insisted that he get a brain scan. The scan revealed tumors in both his brain and his neck. On Saturday, December 26, just 2 days after his 70th birthday, a doctor visited his apartment and told him the devastating news. He had terminal cancer and was estimated to have only a few months left to live. He never got those months. He never even got 2 weeks. On the 28th of December 2015, only 2 days after receiving that diagnosis, Lemmy passed away at home at the age of 70. According to accounts from those close to him, He spent his final hours sitting in front of the video game machine that friends had moved from the Rainbow Bar into his bedroom so he could still enjoy it. The official causes of death included prostate cancer, heart failure, and cardiac arrhythmia. From his final concert to his last day was only 15 days. From learning of his diagnosis to his passing was just 2. Wendy Dio, who visited him alongside his doctor, later shared that even in his final hours, he remained alert, kind, and thoughtful. She recalled that he thanked her for bringing him an antique German military history book. Even at the very end, the lifelong reader and student of history hadn't changed. What Lemmy left behind was far bigger than one band. Nobody seriously tried to replace him because the people closest to Motorhead believed there simply wasn't another Lemmy. In January 2016, his memorial service was held at Forest Lawn in Los Angeles and streamed live around the world, with reports saying that well over 200,000 people were watching at the same time. The tributes showed just how deeply he had influenced rock music. Ozzy Osbourne, who had spoken with him by phone on the morning of his death, called him a hero. Dave Grohl described him as the king of rock and roll and said no one else came close. Metallica said Lemmy was one of the biggest reasons the band existed, while Slash praised his honesty and loyalty, saying he had more integrity than almost anyone he had ever known. After he was cremated, his ashes were placed in an urn shaped like the black cavalry hat he famously wore, engraved with the words, "Born to lose, live to win." Then came one final tribute that could not have been more fitting for Lemmy. Portions of his ashes were sealed inside bullet casings and given to some of his closest friends to keep. It was bold, unforgettable, and completely in line with the man they knew. Fans even launched a campaign to name a newly discovered chemical element Lemmium. It never became official, but tens of thousands of people signed the petition anyway. That alone says a lot about the impact he left behind. In 2025, his hometown of Stoke-on-Trent unveiled a statue in his honor, with a portion of his ashes placed inside its base. Think about how incredible that is.
Well, our philosophy is to have a good time and give everybody else a good time if we can, and if we don't, you have to leave the hole, and that's it. I mean, basically, we just want to be loud, fast, and obnoxious, and have all the obnoxious people in the world cheer. And it seems to be working to an extent. I'm quite happy. I'm doing what I always wanted to do. So I'm having a whale of a time.
The English kid who never truly felt like he belonged was forever remembered in bronze in the town where his story began. A father who left before he could remember him. A village where he always felt different. A band that let him go. The heartbreaking loss of the woman he loved. A body that eventually reached its limit. Through every setback, Lemmy refused to let those moments define who he was. Instead, he turned every obstacle into another reason to keep moving forward. What makes Lemmy Kilmister so fascinating isn't simply that he lived a wild life. Plenty of rock stars did that, and many are remembered only for the headlines. What makes Lemmy different is how many people misunderstood him while he was still here. Most people saw the bullet belt, the cigarette, the bottle, and the rough voice, and thought they had him figured out. But behind that image was a self-taught historian who couldn't fall asleep without reading a book. A man who rejected the hateful beliefs connected to the military items he collected. Someone who carried the memory of the woman he loved for decades and later spoke publicly about that loss while discussing drug policy. Friends remembered him as loyal, respectful, thoughtful, and generous. Even just hours before his passing, he was still thanking someone for bringing him another history book. Lemmy spent his entire life proving people wrong. It started in a Welsh school where he stood out as the only English kid. Later, he faced rejection from his father, from Hawkwind, and from an industry that doubted a loud, rough rock band like Motorhead could ever succeed. Every time someone told him no, he answered by pushing even harder. That determination became one of the greatest careers in rock history. So the next time you hear the opening bass line of Ace of Spades, listen a little more closely. You're not just hearing a song about gambling, you're hearing the story of someone who faced rejection, loss, and impossible odds from the very beginning, yet refused to quit. Born to lose, live to win. For Lemmy, those weren't just lyrics, they were the way he chose to live every single day, right up until the very end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more deep dives into legendary musicians and the untold stories behind them, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. And if you think more people should know the real story behind Lemmy, share this video with another music fan. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.